Developments, and Aaron's going to talk about the South Bay Galleria project. Stephen Proud here from City of Redondo Beach as well. Stephen will be talking about the waterfront development in City of Redondo Beach. And finally, Michael DiBernardo, Deputy Executive Director of Port of Los Angeles, to talk about what's happening in San Pedro. So with that aside, I'm going to start with the basic questions and we move forward. First question to Steve. Is there any news you can share regarding the waterfront project, please?
First of all, good afternoon. I want to thank Mo for inviting us to attend the workshop here and hosting us here at the South Bay Association of Realtors. The waterfront project is an interesting project in the city of Redondo Beach, and if you're reading the newspapers and reading the local news, you're probably about as up to speed as most people are. I'll just give you just kind of a short, brief recap on where we are on the waterfront project today, which is about the best news I can share right now. Most of you may know that the waterfront project in Redondo Beach encompasses about 36 acres of the waterfront area, stretching all the way from Torrance Boulevard up to Portofino Way, and everything from Harbor Boulevard south, Harbor Drive to the west. So it's kind of that area there that has the pier, it has Captain Kidd's, it has Ruby's, the Seaside Lagoon. If you've been in Redondo Beach, it's that zone right there. The project was approved by the city's Harbor Commission and City Council in late 2016, early 2017, but at the time that it was being approved by the City Council, there was a measure on the ballot called Measure C, and that was a local initiative to change some of the local zoning and impact some of the issues that were in the waterfront area. Since that measure was approved by the voters, and since the project was approved by the City Council, there have been a whole host of, unfortunately, legal actions that have been occurring related to the waterfront. There were, at one point, 3 different lawsuits that were going forward on the waterfront project. We are slowly working our way through all of that litigation. I think 2 of the lawsuits, if I'm not correct, have kind of been resolved, and there's one still out there that needs to get resolved before we'll be able to determine what the path forward is for the waterfront project itself. Separate and apart from that, there was some action that was required relative to the project from the California Coastal Commission. Those of you tracking that may know that we had a large hearing in Redondo Beach in early August related to the project with the California Coastal Commission. The decision that was before them was the applicability of the initiative that was passed by the voters, Measure C, to the waterfront. The Coastal Commission basically agreed that the initiative could be applied to the waterfront as drafted. They made no changes to the initiative. So with those actions occurring, having 2 lawsuits get resolved and having the Coastal Commission hearing occur, we're really down to one last piece of litigation that needs to get resolved in the courts, as I said, before we can determine whether we're moving forward or if we're having to move to Plan B with the waterfront project. So I'd love to be here telling you that we're moving forward, we're getting ready to break ground, it's full steam ahead. Unfortunately, the complications of the Citizens Initiative and the legal action that's in front of us is causing a delay in the project right now. So that's really where the project sits right now. Relative to any future development, and when we get to the Q&A, I can probably tackle individual questions for you. I don't want to get too deep into it. The only thing I'll say is, because it is the subject of litigation, depending on the question you ask, we may or may not be able to answer it.
Thank you, Stephen. Back to Michael. So, Michael, let's talk a few minutes about the Port of San Pedro, and also tell us about who is your biggest source of revenue.
My green went away. Okay. Mo, thank you for inviting the Port of Los Angeles today to this event, and really thank you all for being here. It's a great turnout of folks here to listen to what we have to say. Just a little bit about the Port of Los Angeles. The Port of LA consists of areas in San Pedro, Wilmington, the waterfront that's down there. Our neighbor is the Port of Long Beach, which is a competing port. We compete with the Port of Long Beach on vying for cargo and things like that. Our biggest revenue source actually comes in from the cargo container volumes that come through the port. And it's basically from everything you're wearing or anything that you go home and you watch TV, bicycles, things like that. Those are things that come through the Port of Los Angeles, and it's everyday items that we wear and use each day. So the biggest economic engine is container operations. We have about 4,300 acres of waterfront area, waterfront and land, and part of that, along with cargo operations, we actually have an area for our cruise activities. So we are not the #1 cruise terminal in the Port of LA and Long Beach. We're actually #2. Port of Long Beach is bigger with Carnival, who comes in with 3- and 4-day cruises and 7-day cruises. We get everybody else besides Carnival. We get Princess, we get Royal Caribbean, we get Norwegian. Those are cruise lines that come in and also help the economy of passengers that come through, because they do spend money in the surrounding areas. But we are doing 2 waterfront developments, 2 main waterfront developments. And how many, by a show of hands, how many have been to San Pedro lately to see some of the development we're doing down there? Great. We have done some roadway improvements to get better access to what we used to call the Ports of Call, and now we're going to be calling it the San Pedro Public Market. And we have gone out and put out an RFP many years ago to a developer to come in and develop the property down there. So the port is investing some money from our revenues that we do receive. So we receive revenues from our cargo operations. We don't get any taxpayer support. All of our revenue comes in from cargo operations and basically the operations down there. And we're taking 10% of our revenue and reinvesting it back into the public investment plan. So what we're doing is using that money to redevelop the visitor serving areas at the Port of LA and Port and Wilmington area. So we are doing the new San Pedro waterfront area, which is going to have restaurants and shops and things of that nature. In addition, we're spending money out in Wilmington. And if you've been out to Wilmington lately, you'll see that we have the park that's out there. But adjacent to that, we have Banning's Landing area. And in that area there, we're going to be redeveloping the area down near the waterfront, as well as up at on Anaheim, or not Anaheim, but actually Harry Bridges Boulevard and Avalon, and doing some commercial development up in that area at this time. So those are 2 main projects that we have. We're also doing some additional work down at our Cabrillo Marina, and actually there's a brochure that's out that's called the Cabrillo Way Marina Commercial Development Opportunities that we're going to be accepting RFIs for in the near future. And in the first quarter, we have what's called Warehouse 1, one of our oldest warehouses down at the port, that we're also going to be putting out an RFI on for any interest in that area as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Aaron, would you take a minute and talk about the South Bay Galleria project and give us a quick update, please?
Sure. Thank you for having us here today. The Galleria project is actually underway at this point in terms of its entitlement process. Just to kind of back up a little bit, the project was approved by the Planning Commission on April 2018. It was appealed, and we have at this point 3 appeals filed against the project, as well as 1 appeal that was determined not to be valid. So we're scheduled to go to hearing before the City Council next Tuesday night, October 2nd. They'll be considering all of the appeals and conducting what's called a de novo hearing on the project. Just by way of project description, it's a transformative retail revitalization of the Galleria. Most of you know that retail in general is struggling with electronic retail, e-commerce, and so forth. Most of the centers you see in the South Bay are doing something about that and retooling themselves. One term that you often hear is retail, dining, entertainment. That's kind of the new lifestyle center. Some of the terms that get used in your commercial brokerage industry. The interesting thing is, Forest City, who has been the owner of that property since before 1988, when I came to work for Redondo Beach, actually sold the Galleria site and 12 other properties throughout the U.S. to a company called QIC, Queensland Investment Corporation. QIC invests money for the state of Queensland, Australia. So it's actually a government-owned investment here. And they're not looking for a real high return, but they're looking for stability. So we're fortunate to have QIC on board with the project, because they really want a stable return and a project that is certain to succeed. So the project itself transforms the mall from basically what's there now, which is just under 1 million square feet of commercial development on 36 acres, into a kind of new experiential place with lots of open space, outdoor dining, shops and restaurants that are the opposite of your old enclosed mall, basically. There'll be a couple of major park areas in the project, comparable, in fact, larger than Metlock's, larger than the Point. So the outdoor spaces for this project are pretty substantial, and then all of the activities are focused around that. Within the 36 acres, the outdoor spaces are highly programmed. So in other words, there's always something going on there. If you've been to the Grove, you've been to some of the other places, you'll see people go there to spend time, and by spending time there, they end up spending money. And so it's a new alternative to just ordering something online. Is you go here to both have a meal, spend the day, spend an afternoon, and very family oriented. A little bit more towards the entertainment side in the evening, which may not be as family oriented, but you'll have your choice of things to do while you're there. The appeals that have been filed largely are restating issues that were raised before our planning commission in April. In fact, some of the appellants filed the same letters after we fully responded to them. So when we get into the hearing, you'll probably see a long discussion, and there will be a lot of public testimony, but the concerns are what you hear about most new projects is traffic and density or development. Those things are difficult because now the communities are connected and we have legitimate concerns, and we do what we can to try to offset those impacts. In fact, in this case, the projects will be spending at least $1 million in offsite improvements, probably 3 times that by the time this thing goes through the appeal process. So we're actually excited to see, after Nordstrom left the Galleria, moved to Torrance, we're excited to see the center transform itself. And just if you're looking for facts, numbers, and figures, the net gain in retail is about 225,000 square feet. It currently is about a 900,000 square foot site project in terms of retail. We would also, in the Planning Commission approved project, have a 150-room hotel, as well as within that 225,000 square feet, we see an opportunity for business office development, which is a South Bay need based on recent market studies. Locally, BAE just finished a study that shows there's probably a 460,000 square foot demand for new office space in the South Bay. We have in Redondo Beach the lowest office vacancy rate at just about 2%, but we also have the lowest office lease rate, which makes no sense. Let's think about this. So that means we have a little bit of really poor office in town. And actually, if you think about it, there really is no Class A office anywhere in Redondo, except perhaps at Northrop. And so we're trying to fill some gaps. So the Planning Commission approved the ability of the project to have up to 175,000 feet of office space in lieu of the 225 retail. So they can adjust and flex within that in the Commission's approvals. So the project, as I said, is going to appeal hearing next Tuesday night, 6 o'clock, Redondo City Council, if you're interested. But that's the Galleria in a nutshell.
Thank you, Aaron. Back to Stephen. So, Stephen, regarding the waterfront project as proposed, is it still viable?
Well, I think the waterfront project is likely going to have to go through some kind of transformation as part of this process. I think the vote on Measure C in Redondo Beach regarding some of the activities in the waterfront zone is going to require us to have to think through the viability of the project, the size of the project, the scope of the project. to build a project that would be compatible with Measure C would require the project to have to be changed in some significant ways. Very much like what Aaron was saying about the Galleria project, the project on the waterfront had a lot of different components. It was primarily geared around dining and entertainment. It did have some retail components. It had an open space component, had a hotel that was envisioned to be a part of the project. I think right now the community, between the folks who were supporting the project as proposed versus the folks who were supporting the initiative, which I think generally was being driven by a desire to see a reduction in scale, a reduction in size of the project at the waterfront, there's going to have to be some reconciliation in the community about what the appropriate vision is on a going forward basis. The viability of the project itself was being driven in many ways, and the scope and scale of the project was being driven in many ways by the community's desire and the city's desire to use the project as a vehicle to help us improve some of the infrastructure in the waterfront. So, as some of you may know, the parking garages down there are very old. Some of our infrastructure in the Seaside Lagoon is very old. And so the ability to replace some of that critical infrastructure was one of the key components of the waterfront project, in addition to the revenue the city would derive from sales taxes and hotel occupancy taxes and things like that. But we were really looking at this as a revitalization effort and an opportunity to improve and replace some of the aging infrastructure that's in the waterfront. So when we start to talk about viability and we start to talk about a smaller project, if that's what's ultimately going to be constructed, then we'll all have to take a step back, the developers, the city, and look at the project economics and see what kinds of infrastructure the project could support as a development component, but then what kinds of things might the city now have to try to take back off the table and find a way to finance and improve on our own. We were already, as part of the project, going to be replacing the sport fishing pier. We were going to be replacing the municipal pier. We were going to do some of the work right in what we call Basin 3, where the International Boardwalk, where Naja's and Quality Seafood and some of those businesses are in that zone. So we already had some of the infrastructure on our side of the plate, but the rest of it was going to be incorporated into the development program. If the project is changed in scope and scale and the economics change, then we'll be revisiting that agreement with the developer to determine how that distribution of costs and improvements are going to be borne between the two projects. So I think the question of viability is going to be one that gets determined as we start to see how the project unfolds in light of the legal action and in light of the community conversation that still needs to be had regarding the scope and scale of the project.
Thank you, Stephen. So back to Michael. Regarding the project in San Pedro, is there any room for residential on the property?
Oh, great question. And we get a lot of these questions as far as residential in the Port of LA area. And our, as you know, the property all belongs to the state of California. So our trust with the state of California does not allow us to have residential on Port of LA property. We can do hotels, which we do have down at the port, but as far as residential, we're not allowed to have that within the state Thailand's area, and that's part of our trust. So we do get a lot of questions about that. We do have marinas at the Port of LA. We do allow very small, I must say very small, allow liveaboards on board, and that's more for safety and security reasons to have some people down there all the time. But that's the only thing that we have at the Port of LA.
Michael. So back to Aaron. Regarding the Galleria, is the upgrade incorporating the new retail commercial space or new office space, please?
Well, I think I covered that in the discussion, but retail, office, and I failed to mention residential. There, within the project is a residential component that we studied the maximum development of up to 650 units. In the environmental impact report, the project is approved by the commission, proposes 300 apartment and rental units within the project. Those were proposed on the Kingsdale side of the project, but because of resident concern on Kingsdale, there are about 14 residents and a small neighborhood on that side of the property. The applicant moved the residential component to Hawthorne Boulevard. And actually, the Hawthorne Boulevard side has better basin views and better peninsula views, so it kind of covers the concern. The residential will likely, based on late breaking news, will likely include some affordable housing component. That's yet to be determined. So,
Thank you, Aaron. Stephen, back to you regarding the revitalization of the waterfront. So, can we talk about are there any other improvements or new tenant or events coming up, please?
Well, most of our energy had been revolving around the area, as I mentioned, from Portofino way to Torrance Boulevard, kind of what everybody refers to as the Center Cal project or the Waterfront Revitalization project. Within the larger harbor area itself, obviously within the last year and a half or so, Shade Hotel has opened in that area. If you haven't been down to Shade, I encourage you to come down and check out the property. So that's been an encouraging sign. One of the things that's immediately adjacent to the harbor that's on the horizon that you may have read a little bit about is the former AES site. It's not former, I guess, yet, but may soon to be former AES property. So AES has been engaged in a developer solicitation and selection process. So they started it probably about a year and a half or so ago, where they put the property out into the market. They developed a list of developer interest. They've cut that list down to a short list, and as we understand, are in kind of the final negotiations with one or two parties for the ultimate acquisition of that property. And so there's a lot of conversation. We don't know who that is. We don't know who the prospective buyers are at this point. We'll probably find out when you find out, when it gets published in the press. But that will be an upcoming planning and entitlement effort that will need to be coordinated through the city in terms of ultimately determining what the plan is for the site, what the uses are for the site, what the buyer is thinking in terms of adaptive reuse of any of the existing resources that are there, how we do parks and open space, and then ultimately how all of that gets integrated into the larger harbor area. So that's probably the next thing that there'll be some breaking news about relative to the waterfront and the harbor zone is the AES property. We are spending, probably important to say that while the Center Cal project is on hold and we're waiting for the litigation to unfold, we are certainly still engaged in trying to do whatever we can to encourage new tenancy in some of the spaces that we have there. We're also actively engaged in a very robust improvement program to our garages and infrastructure there as best we can with the resources that we have. And so we're really trying to do as much as we can while we're waiting for the results of the waterfront project to unfold.
Thank you, Stephen. Back to Michael. So, why do we have two ports? Port of San Pedro and Long Beach.
Good question, and we do have two ports, and if we go back to over 100 years ago, state of California, when they put the ports together, they said for downtown or in the LA area, we're going to have two ports, LA and Long Beach, and we do have two different trusts with the state of California. And as I mentioned earlier, we do compete on cargo volumes. And actually, the interesting thing about the Port of Long Beach is that they don't have the marinas. The marinas actually belong to the city of Long Beach, as well as their retail visitor serving area also belongs to the city of Long Beach, as opposed to the port. So the Port of Long Beach actually focuses just on cargo movement, container operations, and break bulk and liquid bulk, where we have a little bit more diversity. So we have, as I mentioned before, cruise, we have visitor serving area, we have containers, we have liquid bulk, so we have all the oil companies, we have the fishing industry, recreational boating, and break bulk cargo as well. So we're a little bit more diversified than the Port of Long Beach, but we are two competing ports. And I don't know if you've heard, in the past, Port of Seattle, Port of Tacoma was kind of in the same boat where they had two different ports. And up there they actually combined and did a joint venture, and they call themselves the Pacific Northwest Seaport Alliance. So there have been a number of people that have talked about trying to do the same in LA Long Beach. If there was something like that, it would probably have to go to the state of California voters to determine if that's the route to go, because that's where the trust lies is with the state of California voters. So I'm sure if it goes out to vote to a number of people, they're probably not going to understand a darn thing about it and therefore not vote on it. So, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens on that. But that's why there's two competing ports in LA, Long Beach.
Thank you, Michael. Back to you, Aaron. So regarding the Galleria, how's the upgrade going to fit into the area? And then most importantly, let's talk about transit orientation, please.
Well, then this microphone. Green. Yeah, the Galleria currently is not well integrated with the Artesia corridor and not really connected, except per se by the existing transit center to public transportation. The project includes a variety of different techniques to open and connect the property to. I think I got it now. One of the precepts about an old enclosed mall is it was isolated. So if you look at the proposed project, you'll see you have new bicycle connectivity from all directions and all sides, not only to the project but within the project. So throughout the site, there are new bike lanes, new pedestrian paths. There are pedestrian walkways and paseos that will actually be pleasant for the new residents of the site and all the visitors to the property. The transit center is actually a separate project, was out to bid and will be relocated from the Galleria property itself, just next to Target on Kingsdale. And that will be served by 5 regional bus lines, as the current transit center is. So whether it's bicycle, pedestrian, or other modes of transit, the new project, and scooters, I hear scooters, yeah, and Lime bikes as well, which we'll leave all over the property, by the way. But it'll be closely linked with transit. As Redondo Beach has always been, and going back to the port question, by the way, most people don't know that Redondo Beach was the original port of Los Angeles. Up until about 1920, all of the lumber that built Los Angeles came to Redondo Beach. It was the original deepwater port of LA. So Long Beach and San Pedro came along and kind of stole our show. And we went from a commercial industrial waterfront to a visitor recreational boating waterfront at that point. So we were first.
Thank you, Aaron.
That's true.
Back to Stephen. So, Stephen, regarding timelines for sport fishing pier replacement and other public amenities in the harbor, such as the Moonstone Park, can you talk about that for a minute, please?
Sure. So one of the things that we had been hoping to do as part of the Waterfront project is to take the opportunity to improve a lot of the public amenities that are within the harbor right now. Many of them are aging. Some of them are frankly unsafe. And so what we've been doing is conducting an initial evaluation of those various pieces of infrastructure to determine what the best path forward is for those. So, for example, one of the areas that we've been recently focused on is the sport fishing pier, as Mo suggested. That was where Polly's on the Pier is, and that's where our original sport fishing operations were originating from. We went out, we did some structural assessments of that pier and determined that there were some piles that were in really poor shape, and there were some structural deficiencies. And so we took the first step of relocating those tenants off of that pier, and they're now located down in that same Basin 3 area where Naja's and Quality Seafood is and some of the other operators down there. We've since closed that facility, and we've held a couple of public workshops as well as a workshop with our Harbor Commission to start to talk about what kinds of programmatic elements should be included in any type of a replacement program for the sport fishing pier. And we need to go through that same type of exercise for a lot of the public amenities. So Moonstone Park, there was a master planning process that was engaged in Moonstone Park. We're going to re-engage that master planning effort. The Seaside Lagoon, ultimately something needs to happen at Seaside Lagoon, and so what we've been thinking is maybe the next best step, and it was something that the Harbor Commission has recommended, is that we think about putting together a public amenities master plan for the harbor itself, where we would talk about things like the lagoon, we would talk about the sport fishing pier, Moonstone Park, the public boat launch facility has gotten a lot of press. It's a requirement for us if we build anything new in the harbor to build a public boat launch facility as part of that process. So we've held several workshops on that. So we're actively engaged in the planning process, and we're optimistic that sometime soon we can move from the planning phases for these various public amenities into the design, engineering, and then ultimately the implementation process to start to bring some of these things to life in the harbor and create new public opportunities for folks to go down there and engage in different types of recreational activities.
Thank you, Stephen. Michael, back to you. So a two-sided question. Do you guys receive any taxpayer support? And also, why do we have to have a need for competitive process for the leasing of land?
Okay, so the taxpayer support question, I think I answered that a little bit earlier as well. Our revenues come in from cargo operations. We do not receive any taxpayer support. What we do, because we are part of the City of LA, we do hire the City of LA for certain services. So we do hire them for fire protection. We do have our own police force, which is our own. But we do hire the City of Los Angeles for the fire services, and they do some stuff in recreation and parks for us. In regards to leasing policies that we have from our Board of Harbor Commissioners approved a leasing policy that says that everything needs to go out for competitive bid. And as a city agency, we need to be transparent, and we need to make it competitive for all to come forward. So with the Waterfront project, we did go out with a competitive bid for a developer for the Ports of Call area, and it was awarded to Rakovich Company, a company that's based out of downtown Los Angeles, and also some folks out of the San Pedro area that are redeveloping the Ports of Call area. And they are the master developer. They would be the ones that people, if they want to bring in restaurants or shops, would work through the Rakovich company as far as leasing property from them. So we're allowing Rakovich to do subleases within their permit. We also brought in recently Alta Sea down to the port, and they're a marine research facility, and they also have the ability to sublease and to sublease to different folks that have to do with ocean research and research out at sea. So they have somebody that's growing seafood out in the ocean. That's part of that sublease as well. For the Wilmington waterfront, our plan is that rather than going with a developer, we're actually going to do RFPs for certain parcels within the Wilmington area on the location out there. So you'll be seeing some of those RFPs coming forward for future opportunities in the Wilmington waterfront establishment. But again, the reason why we do, and similar I'm sure to you folks too, is that we do RFPs to make it a competitive bid and to look at all bids and then review and award based on that.
Thank you, Michael. Back to Aaron. So regarding the revitalization of the Artesia corridor, could you talk about that for a couple minutes, please?
Yeah, you know, one of the things I mentioned earlier was viability of retail on corridors, and Artesia is really our main commercial corridor in Redondo Beach. We've noticed that you know, the mom and pops and brick and mortar stores are struggling, and so much of the sales now, almost 15% of our city's sales are going to the unitary pool tax that's for e-commerce. Because of that, Artesia corridor and to some extent Pacific Coast Highway as well really deserves some attention from the city and some forward-thinking planning as far as what uses make sense for the next 20, 30 years. Well, office use we talked about as a viable use, and the city is funding and is currently in process of preparing what's called an area plan, which is much like a specific plan that you'd see, where the community decides ahead of time what types of uses and activities make sense, what should the appearance and design of the corridor be, Architectural guidelines come into play, sign guidelines come into play. And, the last time we made a significant investment, I think I probably just started with the city, was Artesia revitalization and streetscape improvements, and that's been a long time. The city took Artesia back from the state of California. We accepted the highway, so the city owns and controls the right-of-way. That frees us up from Caltrans restrictions on sidewalk design, on trees and landscaping, on car turning movements. All of those things are subject to city review, not Caltrans. And it gives us the ability to really improve the corridor. What we want to do is find the right business mix that is viable, whether it's some retail, some office, some dining, some entertainment. But those things have to be planned. And if the other thing is to work with the property owners. And we've got a number of out-of-area owners that really aren't in touch with their properties. They're just looking at, I can lease it to so-and-so. Stephen's shop in economic development is working with the businesses themselves. He has a commercial facade improvement program where the city's providing money to the businesses on the street. I don't know if that's on Stephen's list of questions, but we all work together, and so I'm in charge of the building, planning, zoning, code enforcement side of the equation, and Stephen is the wheeler dealer over here that tells them they can do anything, and then I tell them no. But anyway, we're trying to move the boulevard along. So.
Thank you, Aaron. Aaron, continue with you. Would you also take a couple of minutes? I know we talked about this before. Talk about Redondo Beach general plan. I just want everybody to know it's happening, what's going on, please.
Sure. It's been a while. Our last general plan comprehensively was updated in 1992. So time has passed us along. The City Council has funded a comprehensive update of the general plan, which is the long-range plan for the community. Initial work is now taking place with a 27-member Citizens Growth General Plan Advisory Committee, which is now met. We've met for about a year, almost at a one-year mark on that. And we'll probably meet for another 6 months before our final recommendations come forward. But it's a community process. There will be public workshops coming tentatively in November, and then again after the first of the year to kind of check in with the community on whether they agree with the GPAC's recommendations. So nice having a 27-member group, but also difficult. But it's a broad representation of the community. The GPAC members really cover the breadth of the opinions in town. And so they're actually working together quite well. Over time, people realize that they need to look for solutions, not just object to problems. So it's coming along pretty well.
Thank you, Aaron. Stephen, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Aaron covered most of it. Just to touch one more second on the storefront revitalization program. So the city council, if you know anybody on Artesia Boulevard who is interested in doing an upgrade to their building, whether they be the owner or the tenant who is interested in doing something on their space, we're eager to talk to them and see if we can partner with them. It is, as Aaron said, it's a free money program. So what we're doing is we're matching investments that property owners are making into their storefront on a 50-50 basis up to certain limits. And so if somebody just wants to simply put a coat of paint on, great. Well, we're happy to participate in that. If they want to do something more elaborate, really do a full-on facade improvement for their building, we're happy to participate at a higher level up to certain thresholds. So Elizabeth Haas from my office is here. So if you know anybody right now, you can rush her and give her the information. If not, we have information on our website about how to participate in the storefront improvement program. And we really see that as, trying to get the ball rolling. We get a couple of store owners that do it, maybe put a little peer pressure on some of those other store owners to get out there, and eventually try to see a revitalization effort happening along the whole boulevard. In addition to which, if you've been up and down Artesia Boulevard, our public works crews have been doing a great job out there right now, improving medians and landscaped areas, and so there's a lot of focus while we're maybe a little slow on the waterfront side at the moment, letting those issues kind of get resolved. There's a lot of focus in the city at the council level, at Aaron's office, our office, on really working and focusing on the Galleria and the Artesia Boulevard corridor and really turning our energy there to try to see what we can do to exact some change up there.
Thank you, Stephen. So just to let you guys know, I had a listing on Artesia Boulevard, and actually that came handy, and they applied and they did the improvements and everything worked out great. So the money is there, but you got to use it before they run out. So if you have anyone, please just reach out to the city and see what they can do. That's the end of our questions that we had. We're going to now open it up to everyone to ask questions, please.
I have, but I'll let you. I'll spread the wealth to the other participants. This is to Steve regarding the waterfront. So I'm a little bit confused. Is Measure C? I mean, once that lawsuit is settled, is Measure C? I know that Bill Brand, the mayor, stopped the Coastal Commission. Now they took it back, and now is Measure C? Did it win again? I'm just confused. Is it on again?
The Measure C was passed by the voters.
Yeah.
And then what needed to occur for implementation of the measure was for it to go to the Coastal Commission, and the Coastal Commission to make a determination as to the validity and the applicability of the entire measure, or would they, in their judgment, determine that some portions needed to be revised. They accepted the measure as approved by the voters. And so, since they didn't make any revisions to the measure, there's no requirement that it go back to the city council or to the voters. And so, it's in effect as we sit here today. What gets tricky, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, is there's a lot of questions about timing of the waterfront project from its approval process versus the timing of when the initiative was approved by the voters. And therefore, there are some legal questions as to the applicability of Measure C to the waterfront project, since it was approved by the city council before Measure C was adopted by the voters. And in addition to that, they received what's called a vesting tentative map prior to Measure C being approved as well. And so that's one of the legal questions that we're still working to get resolution on as to the applicability of the measure to the project itself. The only thing I'll say in addition to that is that CenterCal did withdraw that project from consideration by the Coastal Commission, and the city withdrew our public boat ramp application to the Coastal Commission. So when the Coastal Commission met, the only thing that they had in front of them was the initiative that was passed by the voters. If there's going to be a waterfront project that is going to move forward, it will still need to go to the Coastal Commission for approval. And so then there'll be a standard of review that needs to be decided at that point.
Okay, so Central Cal is completely out.
So not completely out.
Okay.
So CenterCal is, we have a contract with CenterCal, or we had a contract with CenterCal. That's the subject of the last lawsuit that I said that still needs to get resolved, is both sides are claiming that either side has breached that agreement. And that's really the subject of the litigation. So once that piece of litigation gets resolved, either CenterCal will no longer be the partner of the city, or they may be reinstated back into their agreement, and we'll have to figure out what the path forward is from there.
I've got any other questions. But
Did that make sense?
It does.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect. Because it's kind of complicated, so I just want to make sure.
This is to Michael. Hi. Regarding the Portugal restaurant, why did that go away? Like, why is that not going to be part of the?
So Portugal Restaurant is going to be in the future development.
Oh, it is.
They are going to be working with the developer in coming up with a new restaurant. The location where it was at is slated for for the fish market. So there's going to be a realignment of the facilities down there and who's going where. But Portugal Restaurant has been talking to the new developer for a future restaurant down there.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Follow-up questions. With respect to Artesia Boulevard, request access to those funds, correct? So I had an issue with one of my clients where, as a tenant, the tenant had applied for access to funds, and then the landlord came in and said, nope, no, I want them for my building as a whole, as opposed to just the tenant. So how is the city handling that? That's one. And then my second question is with respect to Aviation Boulevard. I attended a session that I think was a session with the Beast Cities Health District and a community event where there was some discussion of making aviation more bike, would involve widening roads, and I just didn't know, I hadn't heard anything more about that.
All right, so I'll tackle the storefront question, and I'll ask Aaron to tackle the aviation question, because I don't know the answer to that one. On the storefront improvement program, I will tell you we do a lot of hand-holding between tenants and landlords to try to get them in agreement on who's going to be the recipient of the funds and what the use of the funds is going to be. If the tenant is the applicant to our program, what we do is we ask that at least the landlord consent to the improvement. So there's some kind of consent that needs to be granted, because we don't want the tenants making improvements to the building that the landlord hasn't agreed to. If the landlord would either like to apply together or as a separate grant application, I think we would think about that as possibly being two applications for one building. We're trying to avoid double dipping. We'd like it to either be the landlord or the tenant, but that said, depending on the level of improvements, we could talk about whether there's a separate agreement between the landlord and the tenants. But we are trying to get both parties on the same side. We hope they have their interests are aligned to see the improvements made to the facility. If the tenant has applied, they need the landlord's consent. Landlord could withhold it if they didn't agree with what the improvements were that were being proposed. Did that answer your question? Okay, great.
Yeah, okay, so the Blue Zones project, and I don't want to get too far afield here, but the South Bay cities have been working on a healthy communities project called Blue Zones, and one of the Tri-City projects, Hermosa, Manhattan, Redondo, was, because Manhattan touches aviation, was to consider designing a Class 2, which is basically a striped bikeway along Aviation Boulevard. Now, it's run into some difficulties, and there's a lot of engineering constraints because, as you know, aviation's a busy street. But at this point in time, I know that there are ongoing meetings between our public works departments and our city engineers about trying to resolve some of those issues to accommodate bicycle traffic on aviation. As a bicyclist, it wouldn't be my favorite route, but it does serve a connection. The other bikeway improvement that's underway is looking at extending the Southern California Edison North Redondo Beach Bikeway. So that would serve a similar route to an aviation bikeway and take you on a Class 1 where you're out of traffic completely. Right now that Edison right-of-way bikeway ends before Inglewood Avenue and doesn't connect you to our transit center. It also ends at Robinson heading towards Northrop, but there's a way to continue on to the Northrop campus. But what that bikeway has become is a pedestrian roadway, and you'll see people exercising there all hours of the day. So aviation is up in the air, and it's really a difficult engineering feat to try to create a bikeway on such a busy roadway. But as I said, the engineers are working on it.
Afternoon, and thank you for the panel. Do you have any updates on the continuation of the MTA into the South Bay, since we touched on the South Bay? And if so, will there also be continuation down Hawthorne to the Del Amo Fashion Center?
Sounds like I'll grab that one. Yeah, so recall about 10 years ago there was an environmental impact report started for the Green Line extension called the South Bay Subdivision to bring the Green Line from its terminus now in Redondo all the way down into, actually ultimately to Wilmington, because Metro owns the right-of-way all the way down to Wilmington Harbor City. The current discussion is the alternative study, And that's information's on Metro's website. But what you'll see is they're studying various alternatives, including the existing right-of-way alignment that takes you down the existing train tracks to Torrance Transit Center, which would be at Crenshaw and the railroad, also to Redondo Beach Transit Center, or looking at an alternative which would use Hawthorne Boulevard as an alignment. And then there's a third hybrid alternative also being studied. So no new news and no selection of alternatives yet, but it's coming very soon.
Hi, thanks, guys. I'd like to ask you, Michael, is SpaceX, have they signed a contract up in the port to lease up there?
Yes, they did. SpaceX has some property in Terminal Island, and it used to be a former shipyard called Southwest Marine, and their plan is to build the BFR, which is the big big rocket. They call it the BFR, and the reason why they came down to the port is their plan is to build it, and then they're going to move it by barge to their launch site. And because it's so large, they can't put it over a roadway to transport it to the launch site. So it is the former Southwest Marine site in Terminal Island. They're going to be they're working with the city of LA right now, building and safety and so forth, to get all their permits to refab some of the buildings that are out there right now, because some of those are historic, and to do their engineering as well as construction out there. About 700 employees coming down to that area. And as you know, down in San Pedro, there's a number of residential homes being built down close to the waterfront, both being residential and retail down on the bottom floor. So a lot of that's probably going to help some of the engineers that are going to be relocating or coming to work at SpaceX.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I don't know if this is on or not. Oh, okay. This is so informative. Thanks to everybody. I have a couple questions, but I'll try to keep it quick. My first question is for the Wilmington redesign. You guys said it was RFI accepted. What is that? What does that mean?
We're going to be putting out an RFI for, our RFI is request for information, but that's for the Cabrillo Marina Way. So we're getting this out to see if there's any interest out there for some pads that we have at our Cabrillo Marina for retail.
Oh, okay.
So that would be for retail down near the marina over in off 22nd Street.
Okay, awesome. And then the South Bay Galleria project, you said it's approved, but then there's 3 appeals. I mean, this sounds super exciting. When do you anticipate to have the final approval to actually get it started?
Well, there's some likelihood that it would be approved or an action would be taken on October 2nd, next week, next Tuesday. After that, the hearing could also get continued, which it might, which would then mean probably a couple weeks thereafter there'd be another meeting. Based on assuming the project were approved, it will be about 6 months before any construction could take place. It's just a factor of working drawing and plan preparation, and then the construction is estimated to take 18 to 24 months for the project.
Okay, so like 6 to 8 months out and then starting it.
So we hope to have a final decision by the end of this year,
Okay.
just kind of put in general terms,
Okay.
and construction beginning middle of next year would be correct.
Okay. And then can I just ask one more question about the waterfront? So the city council's meeting next week, and if it turns out that is there going to be another vote to see whether CenterCal, like, can somebody else put a bid in with a whole other?
Yeah, so the city, we may be blending a couple of conversations. City council doesn't have any action in front of them next week relative to the waterfront project. The only action in the city council next week is relative to the Galleria project. But that said, so like I said, it's kind of complicated, but basically the city entered into a contract with CenterCal. Until we get through the current legal case that sits in front of us, we have terminated that agreement. They dispute that we lawfully terminated that agreement, and that's the subject of the lawsuit. So right now, the city would not be taking any action to go out and find a new development partner and engage in a new process until the old process has been 100% resolved and disposed of. So unfortunately, that's what's keeping us from moving forward is we have this last dispute between the parties that has to get resolved one way or the other. If ultimately the lawsuit is determined in a way that the city took appropriate action in terminating the contract, then we move on to Plan B. And we have not yet formulated Plan B, whether that means we go back out and find another development partner, whether we start to take some of that action ourselves as a city entity, still to be determined in terms of how that process would go forward. So we have a little bit of time. For now, we can't engage in any new conversations with development partners until the lawsuit gets resolved.
You answered the question I was going to ask. What was Plan B? Christopher Barham. I'm a Redondo Beach resident. I live right by Redondo Pier, and I see it there and go by Seaside Lagoon. Do you think there could possibly be a new measure brought together? Because Measure C barely passed, and I agree with what you said earlier. Most residents didn't know what was going on, and there was a lot of mumbo jumbo. So do you think there could be possibly a new measure brought together that could get approved?
Well, I don't know that we need a new measure to necessarily move the waterfront project forward. What I have said to some of the peer tenants and some of the other public groups that I've spoken with is I think the challenge that was associated with Measure C was Measure C talked about some very specific components within the waterfront. Design components for a boat ramp facility, the appropriate size for Seaside Lagoon and whether it should be open to the ocean or not, the addition of parking structures, protection of views. But what it didn't articulate, and the challenge that we have, is it didn't articulate a comprehensive vision for the waterfront. And so what I think we need to do, depending on how the process starts to unfold, is to sit down with, if we have a Center Cal as our development partner or a new development partner, with the community and craft a vision for the waterfront that represents both of those interests. That's our real challenge going forward, because I just don't think we have that right now. And so, how that process plays itself out, again, we need to know who our partners are and what the process is. We need to dispose of that piece of the process first, and understand what the landscape is, and then we can sit down and start to craft a path going forward. It really is being driven by the litigation timeline. That could be anywhere from 2 to 4 years. Unfortunately, that's just, when we've already been in kind of a litigation process now for almost 2 years, and we've disposed of 2 of 3 lawsuits that were related to the waterfront. We still have this last lawsuit that sits in front of us, and it's the most significant because it's the one that's going to determine whether either party made a mistake, and was not made a mistake, but whether either party was in default of the agreement, and if so, are any damages due? And so it's the most significant of the lawsuits that have to be resolved, and so that one's going to take some time.
Okay, the AES project. The poles up 190th, the electrical poles, will those be taken down once the AES project is removed?
Okay, so that's under study right now. The city has paid for and contracted for what's called a method of service study, which analyzes whether you can eliminate those lines. There are basically 2 sets of lines. There's the 66 kV lines that come in. Those arguably serve and distribute power to the power plant. The 240 kV lines that go out, those can certainly be relocated. That's certain at this point. To what point is being studied, whether it's the top of the hill, the first substation beyond, that's what our method of service study looks at. There are also other encumbrances of that land that's mostly owned by Edison. All the right-of-way is owned in fee by Southern California Edison, and it's pretty chock full of things like pipelines and other utility infrastructure as well. So it's a big question, but the answer is some of those lines absolutely can come down, and we're trying to get all of them to come down.
Okay. Central. Okay, so since Central Cal was, so once it's decided on what's going to happen, who is funding this?
Well, I think it sort of comes back to the question about what's Plan B. I think
Yeah.
it makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons to enter into public-private partnerships for these kinds of large development projects. That's why cities and ports do these kinds of things and go out and find these private partners, because we don't have the financial resources as a city or as a harbor enterprise to be able to tackle all of the various infrastructure needs that are there. So what I suspect would occur is either Center Cal will get reinstated into their agreement and we'll renegotiate that agreement to reflect a revised project, or if ultimately they are dismissed from the process and we go out and decide to find a new development partner, then we would renegotiate with them the division of responsibility for those various infrastructure components. It is very difficult for the city to tackle right now all of the needs that we have within the harbor itself. The garage itself, by most estimates, is about a $50 million replacement project. It is a large facility, has over 1,000 parking spaces in it. Some of those are subterranean. And so, you know, the kinds of numbers we're talking about are not the kinds of revenues that the city has either available in its general fund through our capital improvement program or through the harbor enterprise itself. And so that was a lot of the rationale in the first place of going out and finding a private development partner. And so I would expect that when we start to move to the Plan B question and what do we do next, that some version of that partnership structure would be something we would be looking at again.
Can I ask, or do it? Okay. Okay, on Artesia Corridor, is Hagen's, you know where Hagen's is? What is happening there? I have a restaurant listing across the street. It's an escrow, but question is, what's going to happen there?
Absolutely. Just kind of background on this one. The property owner is currently receiving rent for the property from the prior users of the property, and that's one of the reasons why there hasn't been a faster action. I can let everyone know that the city issued interior demolition permits for the tenant improvements that will be taking place. So you'll see work starting to take place on the site, which will ultimately be 2 tenants. The first is 13,000 square foot plus or minus CVS, and then their sublessee will be Grocery Outlet, which is the warehouse groceries provider. I know residents were interested in a higher end store. It's really not up to us because we have retail for retail. Grocery for grocery replacement doesn't trigger any discretionary approval of the city. I also have gone to a few of their outlet stores, and some are good and some are not. We're hoping to get a good one. The one in Santa Barbara is excellent, by the way, on De La Vina Street, but they're not all the same.
Is it called the Grocery Outlet store?
It is Grocery Outlet. And they have your regular grocery stock, but they have rotational products that are more warehouse-like. We have other higher-end markets, and if it doesn't make it, then certainly another store will come along. So.
Okay, one more. Auto was not on the agenda, but anybody?
Sure.
Okay, can we?
The full set of plans for construction. And keep in mind, the last action that the city took was, beyond approving a settlement agreement, was to approve plans for the renovation of the Palos Verdes Inn. So that is now approved, and the plans for the mixed-use project at 115 units plus renovation of the hotel are underway, and they're looking to pull permits by the end of the year on those projects and move forward quickly at that point.
Regarding the Artesia, the power lines that are at the bike path that you were talking about earlier, has that been, brought up in conversation? Because as a residential realtor, people are like, oh, the 2500 block or the 2600 block, and oh, we don't like the power lines. Some of my clients have actually gone and got one of those reader meters, but the majority of people who don't really understand it. So has that been addressed in maybe taking it away or moving it somewhere else?
No, that is a different portion of the grid, and the whole power grid doesn't follow any logical boundaries. As you know, it's not jurisdictional for one city, but that portion of the grid serves our North Industrial Complex and many other cities north and south of that point. So the lines we're talking about are only those heading east-west from the plant, eastward actually. But people that are concerned about power lines, they're strong blighting influence on the neighborhood. Seen various studies as to how much they affect property values, but they do. And you guys probably know better than I do how much, because we actually looked at that a ways back. We'll do what we can within Edison's restrictive rules about improving the right-of-ways and landscaping the right-of-ways. Planting small trees is a relatively hard thing to do, but they're very restrictive on what we are allowed to and can't do. There's 18 acres of property in the city that are in power line easements that the city licenses from Edison and takes care of. We mow and maintain not very well in the past. We're sending more money to get rid of golfers and green up the right-of-ways. As Stephen said, we're shifting our priority to North Redondo right now. That we've spent a lot of time and effort on the waterfront, so we'll be seeing a lot of improvements up north.
I have a question regarding the district erecting a parking structure on Flagler and Barrel.
Well, the Healthy Living Campus project is under a community revisioning process. The director of the district, in fact, has just held some community study circles, and three to be exact, of which we're participating in. So they're looking at bringing back a plan probably beginning of next year. So they got a lot of community input, and they're really trying to re-envision what a healthy living campus is going to be for the community. They kind of upset a few folks with the amount of senior housing. Then some people complained about parking, and so they're trying to balance all of that and get a plan back out for community discussion pretty soon.
With all commercial development, we're talking about it's pretty clear that we're in need of additional housing development in all over California. So one of the important measures on the ballot in November is the repeal of Costa-Hawkins. Los Angeles has already pretty clearly made the city of Los Angeles is favorable towards rent control. That has recently passed that to unincorporated areas. And so I'm just curious, because this affects is what the city of Redondo Beach, if you can share anything about what the pulse is with Costa-Hawkins does get repealed.
I'll take that one, Stephen, if you don't mind. Okay. Well, I can let you know that the city council has a strategic plan. That's a 6-month plan that they put their most important priorities into, and to report on a inclusionary housing option as to whether the city does or does not want to consider requiring affordable housing with new development. What has not been talked about at all, to my knowledge, is any rent restrictions or affordability. It's certainly not in our strategic plan, and obviously would be a big topic of community discussion. So at this point, unless Stephen's heard something I haven't heard, there is no discussion pending before the city.
Hello. I have a question for Aaron. So the power line, about the parking, I heard there was going to be some parking around the area. Was that something going to be happening, or?
Well, a very small amount. There was an old plan called Centennial Park, which was for the year 2000, Y2K. That plan got reapproved and re-implemented by our city council and is funded to go forward that includes a small amount of parking. I think it started out as a large amount and got smaller as people said, don't take our green space. So, I mean, if it's 24 parking spaces, that would be it. It's actually parking for people that want to use the right-of-way that live distant from there.
Okay.
It also could serve as parking for some of the businesses nearby. Exact rules and regulations, TBD on the parking, though.
Okay. I'm sorry, one last question. For South Redondo, the Riviera, closing down that area, is that something going to be happening? Because I know one of the restaurants had some seatings outside, and now they removed it. They back in, I think, one of the new restaurants, the Republic.
So this would be the dining.
Yeah, so I was wondering.
So I'll give that to Stephen.
Yes. Thank you.
No, no, it's not to
It's
Stephen.
not really my question, so Aaron will answer it
No,
for
it's
you.
fine.
See, I get a really limited scope of stuff I have to deal with, and everything else goes to Aaron.
So, the city council had approved a pilot project, which was a 1-year pilot that went on for 18 months. It was to test and to try to see if we could successfully. Ultimately, council decided that it, primarily on the issue of equity and fairness, that unless everyone was able to do this, that it was probably time to terminate that program. There was some litigation. That's all been resolved, and the dining deck is gone. Moving forward, though, the discussion will be, can we provide more outdoor dining opportunities? And we're issuing permits every week for sidewalk dining down there, because we set up a very inexpensive fee schedule for outdoor dining and a pretty simple permit process that the city engineer can issue that encroachment permit. If you don't want to serve alcohol, you can have a minimal permit with a very minimal price. If you want to do full ABC license in the right-of-way, it's a little more complicated, but we're going probably ultimately every restaurant on the street will have an outdoor dining area. Not in the street, not as a parklet, not as we're already the next couple one will be Rockefeller will have one, Gabby James will have one, Sophie's is going to have one at the corner, so everybody's jumping on board. It also helped that the city started active enforcement of outdoor dining that didn't protect the city with insurance and other permit process. So.
This is for Michael. I just mention it, but is there a time frame for the Port of Los Angeles or
So is this for the Ports of Call area? Yeah, it will be in phases. There's certain phases that are going to be opening up for the developer. Our work was primarily on the infrastructure, getting the infrastructure ready for them to begin their construction. So we had to demo a couple of buildings, and one of those was the Acapulco restaurant was demoed. Soon the Ports of Call restaurant will be demoed. There was some asbestos stuff that's being dealt with. So there is a phase approach in there are different phases that the developer has for that area. Yeah, probably anywhere from 5 to 10 years for probably closer to 10 years on the development, because I think, we'll have to see what can happen down there, right? Because it has been, being an end town, it's been difficult to attract retail down there. So we'll have to see how that progresses along the way. Yeah, exactly.
I had a question on San Pedro Port also. You mentioned one of the warehouses coming up for development. I wonder if there's any timing or use for that warehouse?
So the one that is in question is Warehouse 1, which is down at the end of 22nd Street and Signal. One of our older warehouses, 1903, I think it was built, somewhere around that time. So it is historic. The plan is not, it can't be residential, so it can be for other activities, maybe office buildings, maybe art. sort of ideas. So what we're going to do is put out a similar brochure that what we did on our waterfront or the marina, and basically see what sort of interest lies out there as far as the development. It's going to be very costly. The ceilings are lower because it was an active warehouse at one time. So the ceilings are much lower than what you see in here. There is no, you would need to put in new fire escapes, things like that, because it's not ready for somebody to occupy it. So right now we have some files in there, but that's the only thing that we can do. We can only go no higher than 2 floors, and I think it's 9 floors total. Something like that, 7 or 9 floors. But there is fire escape issues. You actually open up the door, the fire escapes are they're cement and they're kind of dangling out there. So, so you'll come down, but not the right way. So that has to all be looked at and redeveloped there. So it is a very old warehouse that does require some enhancements. So it's going to be very costly for somebody to go in there. But that's going to be coming out first quarter of 2019 as far as an interest level out there. Again, not residential, but retail, office space retail, or art galleries, things like that.
This is for either Steve or Al. Regarding Legato again, do you know why they chose apartment units instead of condos? Like, what is do you know why someone would do that? I mean, do you know why?
Well, yeah, I can't speculate on why they chose, but clearly the applicant and developer of that project has a large portfolio of owned apartment rental units throughout the LA basin. Also, if you look at the market and the statistics out there, rental apartments are all the rage. I mean, right now, Redondo Beach has 50-50 renter-owner situation. It's not desirable. Manhattan is in the high 60% ownership category, but we've been as high as 52% renter-occupied in Redondo Beach. We're swinging in the right direction towards ownership, but it does serve a need, and so that's why a developer would choose to do so.
Can I add one more thing on the warehouse one too? We also, if someone's interested for a hotel as well, that's also an opportunity out there because it is a great view. It's got the breakwater view. It's got all the ocean view out there. So hotel is also opportunity.
All right. So I know there's misinformation and disinformation out there. Hope you guys get some of your questions answered. You got a little bit more clarity. So if you're out there and you hear somebody saying something, you can kind of say, well, I was there and I heard, and it's not like that. And then I want to really appreciate you guys, Stephen, Michael, and Aaron from taking, I know you guys are very busy, but we appreciate you guys coming down and talking to us. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.